You are watching an MLGA Network live broadcast. Welcome to Make Liberty Great Again, the best damn Liberty podcast that you've never heard of. I'll be your guide as we peer into the ridiculous reality that is our society and our government. Let's get to it. Welcome to Make Liberty Great Again. I'm your host, Cam Harless, and with me, I have who I'm just going to say is just the most regular of my guests, which is Jessica Green. So say hi, Jessica.
Hi, Jessica.
And so as I may cut this little bit out, but anyone who's watching this live, we're live. So make your comments, but I'm not going to read them until afterwards because I can't do what some of these other people do. I'm way too ADD for that. Joining Jessica and I today is easily one of the best people I've ever met on Twitter. Mr. Warren Dent, who I will call Dent for the rest of the episode. But yeah, we met because we were both in Michael Malice's Twitter comment sections. And so introducing you now to Mr. Warren Dent, who owns a microphone and audio company called Zen Pro Audio. And he does a lot. So welcome Dent. Welcome to
for having me, Cam.
My corner of the malcontented internet.
Hi, Jessica.
Hey. It's nice to meet you in person, but
yes,
I kind of feel like we already know each other a little bit. So
yes, and I've seen you on quite a few podcasts actually as well.
Oh, good. I do get around.
So,
all right.
So one of the things that I have been doing for a while is I stopped doing that news format because that's how this show started, was a news format. And I thought, you know what I'd rather do? I'd rather do what Joe Rogan does, which is talk to people that I find interesting and want to talk to, which is why Jessica's on again, because she just happens to be one of my favorite people to talk to. And I was thinking about it the other day when I don't know exactly what it was, if it was on Malice's Locals or what, but I was like, do you want to come on the show? No, that's what it was. I asked you, do you own a microphone?
Yeah, you did. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of sell them too.
Well, yeah, and you were like, I think that I have to assume that you probably thought that I was coming to you asking to buy a microphone or asking you advice.
50%, I figured it was a podcast question. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Whether it was to be on one or if you needed some advice or something, I don't know.
And it's funny is I did not know that you sold microphones, because that's something that you learn if you're in the Dave Rubin side of the conversation, which is a good side of the conversation, just not one that I'm typically in. I'm in the Malice section.
Right. Yeah.
So
I'm in both. Yeah.
But that's what I thought was so funny, was when I asked you that, you were like, oh, well, I sell them for a living. And I was like, oh, no, I didn't know that. And you're like, no, I donated all of the microphones and sound equipment for Dave Rubin's show.
Yeah.
And I was
That's
like,
awesome.
oh, wow. And didn't you do it for Bridget Fetisi too?
Correct. In fact, this microphone, this is the Bridget Fetisi mic, or you could call her mic the Warren Dent mic. But yeah, she had a real problem with her microphone, probably about, 6 months ago or something like that. And I saw all these people giving her like really bad advice online. And what I did was I got in touch with Malice, because I know Malice enough to get him to ask Bridget to let me talk to her, because her DMs aren't open. I said, can you tell her that I'm like not crazy and I want to help her with a microphone, because I've helped Michael with some stuff as well. It's kind of my thing. When I want to support people online, I really like to actually support them. And anyway, so she finally hit me up, and I was like, hey, your mic sucks and you're getting bad advice, and I've got this mic and I'm willing to give you the whole setup. And I think that would be really great. And she was like, oh, okay, great. And so there you go. So that's how I started off with Bridget as well. So
yeah, you're like the invisible benefactor of the liberty movement. I feel like I don't use the word liberty movement because it died in 2012 when Ron Paul stopped running for president. But
fair enough. Yeah.
But I mean, Dave Rubin, like I listen to him somewhat. For me, Dave Rubin is very guest dependent.
Yes.
And so I will listen to Malice on anything. Yes. And that's most of what I've watched Dave Rubin on. Mm-hmm. The only time that I was ever somewhat disappointed in Dave Rubin was when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting here, this little voluntarist, anarchist guy going, okay, you seriously stop talking about construction. I have the answer.
Right.
Do you remember that moment?
I do. And I remembered that Rogan was annoyed because his dad had worked in construction and he had some different ideas too. And he just kind of didn't want to hear it. But yeah, I think everybody gets in a little bit of trouble when they sort of inject their own politics. Dave is interesting for me in that I found him in, I'm assuming 2015. So about five and a half years ago. And there was this crazy guy, Milo Yiannopoulos, that was out there. And I just couldn't believe how out there the guy seemed to be. And so I started to look around for clips and I found this interview, and it was Dave Rubin interviewing Milo. Again, must have been 2015. And I just loved Dave's interview style. He had a great way of getting information out of people. And his interactions with him were really good. That's actually the moment that I reached out to Dave. So I guess I've known him for about five and a half years now. And at the time, he was doing his show in Larry King's studio called Aura TV. And they had no microphones. And so I said, oh, then that's what I'd like to do. So I got all of the audio equipment out to them. And then a couple of months later, he and David hit me up and they said, well, we're moving into a new studio. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to leave Larry King's RTV. And now we need to design a room and, acoustically treat it and things like that. So we, kind of like hopped on a conference call and talked about the size of the room and all of that. And that was another step that I took with them as well, was to help him with the acoustic panels. And you can see some panels in here also. This is just my office, but this room would be an echoey mess, without it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty much how I started with Dave. And Dave's interesting too, in that, again, people do get into some trouble with their own politics when they get very specific, especially a guy who interviews people. Like, nobody ever really cared about Larry King's politics. I mean, Larry King could talk to David Duke. He could talk to George H.W. Bush. And nobody thought that, Larry King, believed everything that they believe. And Dave had a lot of really cool independent thinkers on early on.
Yeah.
And in that exact time frame, even before, Trump really picked up speed in this modern era, the only thing that I knew was that political conservatism wasn't working. And he had these, again, like even a guy like Milo, if you listen to Milo came from that side of conservatism that is very happy to tell the world this. And most conservatives of the past
he raised his middle fingers.
Yeah. Cue middle fingers
for the audio people.
Yeah, right. So he was very instrumental for me, to tell you the truth, at a time when I just wanted to leave stock conservatism. All I knew is that it never stopped anything, and that it was a campaign promise.
Did you have a Gavin McInnes phase?
Yeah. Yeah, same time as Milo. You find Gavin, and again, he's raising those middle fingers. You find this guy who is willing to tell, what Malice and Moldbug and these guys would call the cathedral, sort of the powers that be. No, we don't want all that war. We don't want all of that other stuff. We want to be left alone. And that's an interesting brand of conservatism that
kind
I
of
think
paleo-ish.
Yes, and I think that it can help a lot of people to maybe take their first steps towards, a more libertarian or, like you said, voluntarist attitude, moving forward. So yeah, those guys were really instrumental for me early on.
Yeah, well, I came in. We all actually have different load-ons to the Liberty movement, or I like to call it the Liberty verse now. Mine was Ron Paul back in about 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. I'm the basic bitch of Liberty, Jessica here came from the Bernie Sanders left.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then like I really appreciated what I appreciate about Milo Yiannopoulos, and what I appreciated about Gavin McInnes was that middle finger to the system, to the cathedral, and all of that. And I enjoyed that. But when Tom Woods introduced me to Malice with that scalpel-like laser precision of the middle finger, I was just like, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to mock the system. I want to mock the bad guys.
Yeah. If I can talk about Tom Woods for a second.
Absolutely. A very failed podcaster.
He's my favorite.
I love Tom, and I'll tell you why. So again, I'm on my journey, and I just want to get away from political conservatism. I don't really know what libertarianism is. I've got that sort of old conservative view of libertarianism that, they get a lot of things wrong, but they get a lot of things right.
Yeah.
And I said, that's it. I'm going to the Libertarian convention. And I went in 2016. I drove to Florida. All right. I'm here in the South. So I drove to Florida. It wasn't that crazy. And here I was in the middle of all these people to check out a sort of a movement or a mindset. I don't even know what it is, right?
Yeah.
And the first thing that happened when I got there,
was it James Weeks?
No.
Running around naked?
Is that the dude that took all his clothes off?
No. Yeah.
Could you see my hackles going up?
Yeah, that was like 2 days later. So I get to the convention, and I bought like the freaking gold package. All right. Like I'm allowed to watch speakers and go to events and all this kind of stuff. The very first event that I went to was a luncheon, and the guy that was speaking was Tom Woods. And I went through the little buffet, and I got some chicken and some veggies and stuff, and I sat at a table, and all of a sudden this other guy comes over and sits next to me, and he's got a rubber boot on his head. And I mean, obviously, it's Vermin Supreme. But I had no idea who he was. It was very obvious that there was 3 guys across the table from us. They knew who he was. I did not know who he was. He took the hat off before he ate. And, we just kind of said hello.
Which is polite. Which is polite. That's the polite thing to do. Remove the rubber boot before
off your head before we're eating. And he literally sat right next to me. So my first experience was watching Tom Woods speak, sitting next to Vermin Supreme at the 2016 LP convention. And here's the thing that I have to say about Tom. Tom is the perfect avenue for any stock conservative to take a look at libertarianism, whatever you want to call it. And because everything that Tom talked about, it didn't matter if it was finance, war, law, it didn't matter. It all made sense to me, but it had none of the statist solutions.
Yeah.
And I was just like, what is the deal with this guy? Like, I agree with everything he's saying, but he's also not saying anything that like a Republican would say, or even a conservative would say. And so Tom really was the first real big step for me, bigger than anything I saw at the convention, including the naked guy. I was in the room when that happened. That was really, people were so good. Yeah.
The really cool thing about Tom Woods is that you come from a more conservative arena, and I come from like a leftist socialist Bernie Sanders arena, and Tom Woods was the gateway for both of us because I have a similar, I didn't see him speak live, I just listened to his podcasts.
Yeah.
But the way he made sense wasn't through rhetoric and, you know, demonization and all of those other things. And he also wasn't calling me an idiot for not understanding.
Right.
And that was something you really didn't get from like your political enemies. They don't give you the opportunity to learn things because they're so busy calling you stupid and calling you an idiot. They assume that you can't learn or you can't be taught or disabused of your bad ideas. And Tom doesn't do that. He just tries to give you the facts so that you have them as tools. I really appreciated that about him. And what I think is great is that you come from the right and I come from the left, and we both found the same doorway, which was Tom.
That is absolutely amazing. One thing also, I know that you said you came from the Bernie side. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I'm able to say as a guy who's, definitely in the libertarian camp is that Bernie Sanders, I believe he's a good person. And so, in other words, if you stand with conservatives, it's like you can't even say that. It's like, no, yeah. I think he has bad ideas. He also has a few good ideas, right? He's good on criminal justice reform. He'll work with Rand Paul. He and Senator Mike Lee have, worked on, the war in Yemen and things like that together. It's blatantly obvious that Bernie is essentially a good person. The bad thing is that he is also protesting for total domination and control over all of our lives. And so, I can't really have that either. But
unfortunately,
Bernie, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is that I don't hold quite such a generous opinion of Bernie Sanders any longer, although I used to be one of his supporters. I think now I can clearly see that his function is to round up progressives back into the Democratic Party, that he goes and collects all the little wayward sheep and gets them to vote, because he has endorsed every single Democratic candidate that has come down the line for the last, how long has he been in government? 200 years? So
you're saying he's a Judas Goat.
Yeah.
He plays a very good character and he does it very well, but I don't see that honesty in him. I think that it's a pantomime. I think it's an act.
I think they allow him to go a certain distance. And the other thing is that he won't join their party. So there's going to be some distance between Bernie and the actual Democrats. They're never going to trust a guy that doesn't have a D after his name. Tulsi Gabbard, I would put her in the same camp as Bernie. I think that Tulsi Gabbard is a good person. And I think that she's right on issues of war, the war on drugs in particular, which I'm very passionate about the war on drugs. I don't even drink alcohol. I don't do drugs. In fact, I've never done that my entire adult life, and I'm 49 years old. So,
that's really impressive.
Yeah.
An impressive thing.
It's never bad. I deleted it very early on. Let's put it that way. So as an adult, I've never actually experienced it, and I have no desire to. But I put Tulsi in that same camp. I think that she's good on a lot of similar issues. But again, then you look at the Green New Deal and all this other stuff, and it's like these people just want to spin you into the ground and basically enslave you with debt. So I put her in the exact same camp.
Am I the only one that when I look at Bernie Sanders, well, for one, I can't really get past his little rape story that he wrote. And so that gives me like that really creepy, touchy uncle vibe. But also he just looks to me like he drank a big old glass of milk about 2 days ago and hasn't showered. And the lingering smell of rotten milk is always following him around.
Wow. I think you could even go back to footage from the early 80s and apply that same thought process to Bernie's appearance. So
I'm just saying, does he not look like he stinks?
Yeah, that's kind of right. Yeah.
To be fair to him, he's been old for as long as we've been alive.
Yeah.
So,
I think he's been old for as long as he's been alive.
Right. He came out like that, basically. And
yeah, he's like the Steve Martin of politics. He's always looked 70.
So I'm sure some of the timbers are rotten. You can't get away from that. But that's our entire body of government is 450 years old. They've been here since the Civil War, most of them. So and seem to carry on a lot of the same values as they did then. So I don't really know what to do with the fact that we have this aging government. But I know when something like that was happening in Russia, their government collapsed very shortly after all of their old governors died. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 or so years when all of these old guard politicians start dropping off the map.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Gen Z, I've got some kids that are Gen Z, and sometimes I wonder if they'll pull through and, try to look for some freedom in their lives.
Let me ask you, so you started kind of your liberty journey sometime around 2015, you said.
Mm-hmm.
And so how long where are you now on that spectrum? Because we all know it's a spectrum, if you catch my drift. But how far along the liberty journey are you, if I can ask?
Wow. So socially, I'm very conservative now, but however, I don't mean that on a legal or governmental level at all.
We're on the same page.
Yeah, it's just the way that I live my life, the things that I teach my children, the things that I
which you have
morally approve of. What's that?
Which you have 8 of.
Yeah, just 8.
And I have 5. So it's like you are me in the future if I don't, get the little snip snip.
Oh, don't do that. Don't do that. You don't want to do that.
But yeah, I would say that we're probably in the same categories when it comes to that. Like when I'm asking that question, it's less about, are you pro sex work? I'm not pro sex work. I'm legally, if you want to do that, do it.
Correct.
But I'm not going to celebrate it. And I'm not going to be like, you go girl, because I just feel like that's a harmful thing.
Sure.
Whether or not that offends someone is neither here nor there, because I don't want to prosecute them for doing it.
Yes, I've never understood. In my short period of time, heading more and more towards freedom, I've never understood the thought that you should sort of delete morality as a way of deleting government. It's like no, like that's there are people who make that sort of case, and I don't understand it. Socially, none of my views have really changed. I don't want to add prison sentences to things. I mean, I don't like drugs. One of the favorite things that I ever heard Ron Paul say was, I don't like the drugs, but what I really don't like is the drug war. And then he just rattles off every reason why you should not want to add a prison sentence to somebody who's got an addiction or some kind of other problem. And that was amazing to me. And that was something, he was probably saying, well, he said those things for a long time, but I probably heard him say that around the time that you're saying that you picked up on Ron Paul. And it made a lot of sense to me. Like, why would you do that? I'm also not one of these people who's like, oh, let's take all the money and put him in rehab then. Well, no, because now you're still promoting this sort of cradle to grave idea of government, that every problem I have, I should be able to turn to my senator and get somebody else to pay for it and somebody else to take responsibility. So, I mean, would I take, if you said, here are your 2 choices, rehab or jail? Of course I would take rehab.
Right.
But I'd rather just delete the government from all of that stuff.
Right. Because when people make that plea to do more rehab, to pay for rehab, to do that, they're ignoring how addiction works and how people free themselves from addiction. I have not known a single person who has continued being clean from drugs or alcohol who didn't make that decision themselves. Right. They didn't get to that point and voluntarily choose to stop.
Right. Exactly. So in other words, what you're saying is just because you got caught doesn't mean you're at rock bottom. It doesn't mean that you're in the final phase of waking up, because I've been through these programs. And the one thing that I do believe is that once you hit the bottom, you're going to keep going. You're either going to head towards death or you're going to head towards prison, possible insanity, mental issues and things like that. So you do have a choice. So I agree with that. Just being arrested with drugs or whatever doesn't mean that you're ready to actually give them up. So that's a really good point.
Well, and not to mention, like, when they've studied addiction, they have found that a lot of the reason that people go towards addiction happen to be like community problems. So these are people that do not have the support systems they need. And so, yeah, providing them with rehab might seem like you're providing them a support system, but if they didn't choose it and they don't want it, that's not fixing the underlying issue that led them to addiction in the first place. So even if you get them in a bed, tie them down, and get rid of all of the drugs in their system, at the end of their stay, the issue hasn't been addressed. And that issue, I don't believe, can actually be addressed until that individual chooses to address it. And this is coming from a kid whose dad was a heroin addict before I was born. And he was able to kick that. He went through Teen Challenge. I don't know if you know of Teen Challenge.
No.
It's a Christian drug rehabilitation ministry.
Yeah.
And he did that back in the 80s. Unfortunately, when you were 30 something, you've been doing heroin since you were 16 years old, there are issues that continue. And unfortunately, I no longer have him around. And so that's very sad. But one of the positives of seeing someone choose to change